Welcome back to the deep dive. Sometimes we stumble onto these stories that are just like, whoa, how have we not heard more about this?
Yeah, the connections are kind of mind-blowing once you start digging.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're doing today, folks. A deep dive, and I mean deep into the background of Elon Musk.
Yeah, Elon Musk, the man of the moment, or at least one of them.
Always seems to be in the headlines, right? But today, we're going beyond the SpaceX launches and Tesla tweets. We're going way back to his family's roots.
Roots that run deep in South Africa during a very specific, and let's be honest, very troubled period.
Apartheid. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You sent us some sources that suggest links to, well, even neo-Nazi sympathies, which is heavy stuff.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions about how this past might be shaping the present.
And that's what we're here to unpack. So, for you, the learner, buckle up. This deep dive is going to take us from 1930s Canada all the way to, well, the headlines you're seeing right now.
And trust me, you'll come away with some serious aha moments.
And we promise, no history lectures. We're keeping it conversational and relatable, as always.
We're all about those connections, those threads that help us make sense of the world.
All right, let's jump in. So, Elon Musk, born in South Africa, 1971. But the story really starts with his grandfather, Joshua Haldeman.
Right. And what's fascinating about Joshua Haldeman is that he immigrated to South Africa in 1950.
Okay, 1950. Significant year.
Hugely significant. This is when the apartheid system, already in place, was really starting to clamp down.
Like really codifying the segregation and discrimination.
Exactly. Specific laws, policies, a whole system designed to cement white minority rule.
So Haldeman is arriving right as this system is solidifying. What does that tell us?
Well, it suggests he wasn't just looking for a change of scenery. He was, according to Chris McGrail, a journalist who covered South Africa extensively, actively drawn to this system.
Wow, okay. So he's not just a passive observer. He's choosing to be a part of this.
It seems so. And McGrail draws this really stark parallel that's hard to ignore between these apartheid laws and the Nazi Nuremberg laws of the 1930s.
Whoa, okay. Explain that connection.
Both sets of laws, at their core, were about stripping a specific group of their rights. In South Africa, black people. In Nazi Germany, Jewish people.
So we're talking about systematic disenfranchisement, denying people basic freedoms.
Exactly. Things we take for granted. The right to work where you want, to live where you want, even to own land.
And land ownership, particularly in that context, is crucial.
Absolutely. Because even before apartheid was formally codified, the 1913 Land Act had already dispossessed most black South Africans of their land.
So by 1950, when Haldeman arrives, the playing field was already massively tilted.
Right. A small white minority controlled the vast majority of the land, the resources, the power, and apartheid just built on that.
And it's into this system that Elon Musk is born in 1971.
Right in the thick of it. And to add another layer, the prime minister of the time, John Vorster, had a very specific history himself.
Okay, what's the story with Vorster?
Well, in the 1930s, he was a member of the OB, a pro-Nazi militia operating within South Africa.
A pro-Nazi militia. You're kidding.
No kidding. They were openly sympathetic to Hitler's regime and even engaged in attacks, including burning Jewish businesses.
Wow. So as the world is gearing up to fight Hitler, you have this faction within South Africa actively supporting him.
And Vorster was right in the middle of it. When South Africa eventually joined the Allies in World War II, the OB, including Vorster, vehemently opposed it.
Wow. They must have felt pretty isolated.
They did, but they were also pretty hardcore. They actually tried to contact German military intelligence.
Seriously, what were they trying to do?
They wanted to overthrow the South African government, assassinate the prime minister, and align with Hitler.
That's chilling. So this guy, who later becomes prime minister, is a literal Nazi sympathizer.
And he didn't shy away from it. In a speech in 1942, he explicitly equated Christian nationalism in South Africa with Nazism and fascism.
What did he mean by Christian nationalism?
It's a specific ideology, popular among Afrikaners, that intertwined a very particular interpretation of Christian identity with Afrikaner nationalism and, crucially, white supremacy.
So not just nationalism, but a racially charged ideology with disturbing parallels to what was happening in Europe.
Exactly. And by the time Musk is born, this ideology is deeply entrenched. It's the foundation of the government, the education system, the whole social fabric.
So we've got the grandfather arriving as apartheid is taking hold, and the prime minister during Musk's childhood with literal Nazi ties. It's a heavy backdrop, to say the least.
It is. And it's worth noting that while the grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, arrived without much wealth, Elon Musk's father, Elon Musk, made a fortune.
Oh, right. He was in the mining business, wasn't he?
Yeah, emerald mines in Zambia. And this was during the 60s and 70s, a boom time for mining in that region.
But also a time of, let's be honest, some pretty brutal exploitation.
Absolutely. Mining conditions were often horrendous, with high death rates and little regard for workers' safety.
But highly profitable for the owners.
Sadly, yes. And this stark contrast, this wealth built on the backs of others, was a hallmark of the apartheid system.
And how did that wealth translate into their lifestyle?
Well, McGreal describes it as a neo-colonial lifeboard. Servants, sprawling properties, all the trappings of luxury.
A lifestyle made possible by a system built on racial hierarchy.
Precisely. And when Elon Musk divorced Elon's mother, his assets included a yacht, a private jet, multiple houses.
Okay, so we're talking serious wealth. And speaking of Elon's mother, Mae Musk, she was also a supporter of apartheid.
Yes, both Joshua and May Haldeman were avid supporters. He stated his support as his reason for moving to South Africa, and she lived there for many years.
It's striking that they were both from Canada with no prior connection to South Africa. What was their background that might explain this?
Well, in the 1930s, Joshua Haldeman was the leader of the Canadian branch of a movement called Technocracy Incorporated.
Technocracy Incorporated, what was that all about?
Essentially, they wanted to get rid of democratic government.
Whoa, okay. Replace it with what?
A system run by technocrats, engineers, big business types. It was partly a reaction to FDR's New Deal in the U.S.
So a pretty radical anti-democratic stance from the get-go.
Yeah, and through the 30s, the Canadian technocracy movement started taking on some pretty fascist characteristics.
Like what?
They adopted gray uniforms, modeled after Nazi attire. So the visual connection was pretty blatant.
Well, not exactly subtle. And how did Canada react to this?
Well, when war broke out in 1939, they banned the movement outright due to its Nazi sympathies.
And Haldeman himself.
He was arrested. They found pro-Nazi and subversive materials in his house.
Wow, so this is serious stuff.
Yeah, he was imprisoned for a few months and then placed on a subversion watch list for the rest of the war.
So the Canadian government considered him a legitimate threat.
Absolutely. And yet, a decade later, he chooses to move to South Africa, a country embracing the very ideology he was promoting.
It's really quite a journey. And even after the war, he didn't let go of these ideas.
Not at all. He started another movement in Canada, this one promoting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh, wow. That's deeply anti-Semitic.
It is a fabricated text used to justify persecution of Jews. But post-Holocaust, this didn't fly in Canada.
So he sets his sights on South Africa, where apartheid is taking root.
Exactly. It seems he saw in apartheid a system that aligned with his own vision of a rigidly controlled society.
A society built on racial hierarchy, control, and a rejection of democratic norms. It's a disturbing pattern.
It is. And this context of white privilege and apartheid's legacy extends beyond the Musk family. Yeah. Chris McGreal also talks about Peter Thiel, another prominent figure with roots in the region.
Thiel, the PayPal guy, right? Big tech investor.
The same. And his story connects to a similar history in Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia.
Okay, what's the connection?
Well, Mark brings it up in relation to the recent passing of Sam Nujoma.
Nujoma, the former leader of Namibia.
Exactly. He was a freedom fighter who led the country to independence from South Africa in 1990.
A long and difficult struggle.
It was. He was the head of SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, which was Namibia's liberation movement.
And they were based in Angola, right?
Yeah, after Angola gained its independence, it became a crucial base for SWAPO to fight against South African occupation.
And that's where Thiel comes in.
His father worked on a uranium mine near Swakopmund in Southwest Africa. Thiel lived there as a child.
So he's growing up in this region during a time of intense conflict and political upheaval.
Right. And to understand the context, Southwest Africa had a pretty complex history itself. It was a German colony, then under South African control.
So a mixed population, including a lot of people of German descent.
Yeah. And Swakopmund, where Thiel lived, was known for something quite disturbing.
What was that?
It was a hotbed of Nazi support, even into the 80s and 90s. Open displays of Nazi salutes, merchandise, even celebrating Hitler's birthday.
Wow, that's really unsettling. So Thiel's childhood is steeped in this environment.
He even attended a German school there. It makes you wonder how that specific environment, beyond just a general brutal education, might have shaped his later views.
Right, his strong libertarian leanings, his distrust of government. You have to wonder if there's a connection.
And adding another layer, the uranium mine Thiel's father worked on had a pretty dark history itself.
What do you mean?
The uranium from that mine actually contributed to South Africa developing atomic bombs in the 70s, a program they worked on with Israel.
Seriously. So there's a direct link between Thiel's childhood and the apartheid regime's nuclear ambitions.
And there's even speculation that the uranium South Africa supplied to Israel came from that very mine.
Wow, so we're talking about some pretty high-stakes global connections here.
Absolutely. And Thiel has talked about his time in Southwest Africa, describing his education there as brutal and saying it turned him against government.
But McGreal offers a different perspective, right? He talks about this distinction between Afrikaner and English-speaking whites in South Africa.
Right. While many English-speaking whites claim to be against apartheid, they benefited from it.
So, complicit, even if not actively supporting it.
Exactly. And McGreal suggests that figures like Musk and Thiel, who benefited from the system, tend to deny responsibility for it.
They might blame it on Afrikaners or the government, but not acknowledge their own privilege.
And maybe they embrace libertarianism as a way to reconcile this, attributing their success solely to individual talent.
So, this shared background, this potential shared worldview, might have influenced the formation of the PayPal Mafia.
It's likely. Musk and Thiel co-founded PayPal, and their shared libertarianism, their opposition to things like DEI, seem to stem in part from this foundation.
And McGreal points out that Thiel seems to buy into this anti-white narrative that's been pushed by some white South African groups.
Yeah, like AfriForum. And another PayPal Mafia member, David Sachs, was born in South Africa and shares similar views.
So there's a pattern here, and this group has become incredibly influential, with Sachs even advising Trump.
It's fascinating how their financial success seems to have reinforced their anti-government stance.
And to add one more name to the mix, McGreal mentions Roloff Botha, whose family has deep ties to the apartheid regime.
Yeah, his grandfather was P.W. Botha, the last foreign minister of apartheid South Africa.
Wow, so yet another connection to the highest levels of that government.
And P.W. Botha's job was basically to try and spin apartheid for the West, to make it seem less awful.
To downplay the brutality and claim reforms were happening.
Exactly. But in reality, he was just trying to preserve the system. He was, in the end, quite delusional about it all.
So we have these individuals, all with deep ties to apartheid, who have become powerful figures in the U.S.
It's a pattern that's hard to ignore. And it makes Elon Musk's own departure from South Africa in 1988 at age 18 pretty interesting.
What's significant about that timing?
Well, that was the age when white males became eligible for conscription into the army.
So he could have ended up fighting in the border war or suppressing uprisings in black townships?
It was a very volatile time. And his decision to leave coincided with a period of potential personal risk.
And this historical context sheds new light on some recent U.S. policy decisions.
Right, like Trump's order to cut off aid to South Africa and offer refugee status to white South Africans claiming discrimination.
It certainly evokes the narratives of the past.
Yeah, it does. And the reactions in South Africa have been telling. Groups like AfriForum, who've been pushing this white genocide narrative in the U.S., have backpedaled.
Really? Why the change of tune?
Well, it seems their rhetoric has backfired in South Africa. They're facing accusations of treason for their previous claims.
So playing the victim card in the U.S. didn't go over well at home.
It seems not. And this whole Afrikaner victimhood narrative has a long history.
Like that De La Rey song McGreal mentioned.
Yeah, it tries to evoke the Boer War era, a time when Afrikaners did suffer. But they use it to justify apartheid.
To frame it as a necessary defense of Afrikaner culture.
And it's interesting that Trump's policy has had some unintended consequences, like canceling duty-free imports from South Africa.
So the white farmers who are complaining of oppression are now facing economic hardship.
It shows how these narratives can be manipulated and how policies can have unforeseen effects.
And the appointment of Leo Brent Bozell as U.S. ambassador to South Africa adds another layer of complexity. His son was involved in the January 6th insurrection.
It's a tangled web, for sure.
It is. So to wrap up, we've gone from a grandfather embracing apartheid to a father profiting from it, and then to a group of powerful tech figures whose worldview seems shaped by this history.
The connections are there, and they raise big questions about how the past influences the present.
And for you, the learner, we hope this deep dive has provided some food for thought.
Maybe you'll see those headlines about Musk, Thiel and others in a new light.
And here's a final thought to ponder. How much does a nation's past shape its present? And what responsibility do individuals bear for the systems that benefited their families, even if those systems were unjust? Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.